This is Terms of Reference podcast number 165.
The biggest challenge today is the rollback of press freedom around the world. And we can experience it here, even in the U.S. The current administration's approach to media is radically different from anything we've seen before. And that has really strong knock-on effects in the rest of the world. Many of the things that we're seeing here in the U.S., we've been dealing with those issues since the beginning. That's been our mission.
This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Leddick. It's taken me a while to figure out how to introduce today's topic. Not because it's totally radical, but rather because my brain is freaking out that it's something I actually have to introduce at all in the year 2017. So I've decided the best approach is just to dive right in. Today's topic is, essentially, freedom of the press. Now, while I don't spend my day-to-day life in the United States, I'm definitely an American. And something that is just a part of who I am is an understanding that we need freedom of speech and freedom of the press to ensure human flourishing. I think there's a fairly decent consensus on this around the world. As I've watched events unfold over the past year related to U.S. politics and how it's impacted individuals' ability to distinguish between fact and fiction and, more importantly, destroyed people's ability to have even the simplest conversations, I'm left wondering if Mike Judge didn't have an amazing crystal ball when he made Idiocracy. Now, I personally remain optimistic we'll all come out of this moment in time better for it. But the fact that it feels like we've stumbled backwards into the 1940s in so many ways is truly heartbreaking. My guest for today's 165th Terms of Reference podcast is Harlan Mandel. He's the CEO of the Media Development Investment Fund, or MDIF. Their work focuses on supporting independent media around the world, and they do this through a variety of investment vehicles. The work of MDIF has been transformative across the globe. I think today's conversation is important because we talk about how an organization like MDIF supports freedom of the press, how they have evolved over the past 20 years, especially with the advent of digital everything, how events in the U.S. are reverberating across the world, and much more. I spoke with Harlan in New York. But before we get started, a quick word from our sponsor.
The Terms of Reference podcast is sponsored by International Solutions Group, helping to improve the social impact of governments, UN agencies, NGOs, and companies for more than 10 years. Visit ISG online at www.theisg.com.
Hello, Harlan. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here with you.
Harlan, you are the director, the leader of an organization called Media Development Investment Fund, or the Media Development Investment Fund. I call it MDIF. I hope everybody else calls it MDIF.
Some people do. Some say MDIF. I think that's what we say these days.
MDIF. Okay, great. Where are you located? Where are we talking to today?
So I'm in New York City.
New York City, and we're doing this in the middle of July, so I hope you have air conditioning.
We do. Thank goodness. I'm still recovering from the trip to work, though.
Oh, holy smokes. I like not to butcher what other organizations are about, so why don't we start by you telling us about what MDIF is about, and we'll start from there.
Sure. So, we're what these days is called an impact investment fund. So for me, the most important part of that is the word impact and the kind of impact we're trying to have. So what matters to us is freedom of the press, accountability, transparency, access to information, media diversity, and democratic change. So these are the things that we're trying to promote around the world, and we do that by helping with the development and strengthening of independent media companies around the world.
So you're just trying to solve a few small problems to a relatively niche market.
Exactly. Exactly. I would just say, I think most of us, especially you right now, I would assume, have a strong sense of the power of media. And that's why, we feel this is such an important kind of company to be working with and strengthening.
You've been around for a while. Is that how it's truly started? Investors got together and said, we want to do impact investing, or has that been sort of an evolution in what your organization seeks?
Well, we were formed in 1995. We did our first loans in 1996. And, back then, those words didn't exist. Impact investing, nobody had spoken them. Venture philanthropy, mission investing, all of these concepts hadn't really been framed yet. We were formed as a specific solution for a specific problem, and that was, lack of access to capital that media companies were experiencing in originally in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And quickly it became clear that that problem existed all over the world, and the solution was needed all over the world. So the industry kind of grew up around us. There were no conferences, there were no articles about it or periodicals dedicated to it. None of that existed.
Yeah, it wasn't sexy, in other words. So before we dive into the community of impact investing and that kind of thing, I think it's important, what are the nuts and bolts of how MDIF works? A quick glance at your website, it's clear, you provide financing of a sort to these media companies. And from what I can tell, it's loans, but it's also equity, but the majority is loans. Just take us really briefly through those mechanisms and how you make a decision between them and those kinds of things.
Sure. And maybe I could go back a little bit, keying off of what the previous thing we were discussing, how we started.
Sure, of course.
So, we started, as I said, in the mid-'90s, and that was a time, it was a few years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the wars in Yugoslavia were raging. And there were two phenomena going on. So one, in a large part of the world, there were independent media companies starting up for the first time, because they had not been allowed to operate previously. And at the same time in Yugoslavia, it was quite well recognized by the international community that media and the manipulation of media and news and information was a key component of what created that conflict. The way it was Slobodan Milosevic and other leaders of the region took advantage to create conflict where there really hadn't been ethnic conflict previously. So at the time, all of these media companies were largely being supported almost as nonprofits, even though they were formed as companies. And I would say the innovation that our organization brought to the table was to treat them as companies and to recognize that they really needed significant capital to grow, just like any company. And at the same time, they really needed strong management to be successful. Mm-hmm. So where the field had been dominated previously by journalism training, we injected into the field the idea of really building sustainable media companies that could stand on their own feet and truly be independent. So the mechanisms that we used to do that, originally the idea was just give them capital. So originally we started off as loans, and our name originally was Media Development Loan Fund. And our founder was a guy named Sasha Vucinic, brilliant former journalist from Yugoslavia. He had the insight originally that access to capital was the critical thing. But when they went to make their first loans, and this was in 1996, it quickly became clear that the companies that we were trying to work with, they couldn't even put together a real business plan. Mm-hmm. So we really needed to help them from the ground up. And back in those days, we would start working with a company by training them how to use Excel. It was that fundamental. So a lot of this has changed. The companies we work with are much more sophisticated often than they were back then, because the world in many ways is more sophisticated. But the core proposition that we offer remains the same. So it's access to capital without strings attached, meaning that once we've confirmed the quality and impact of the news and information that a company is providing, we do not get involved in their editorial process. And that's what's unique, I would say, about our funding for news organizations in the developing markets that we work in. There is access to capital, but people want to control what these companies are communicating to the citizens.
When somebody gets a loan or an equity injection from you, you've emphasized management, you don't emphasize that piece of it. Is it also used for equipment? Is it used for connectivity, for bandwidth, for other things? Or do you have a specific portfolio that you constraint to what the money can be used for?
So our goal is to strengthen the economic base of the companies that we're working with. So our financing is almost always geared around some growth project. And that really varies depending on the company and the media. So for TV stations, for example, we would finance a stronger transmitter that could increase their reach and their audience size, or construction of transmitters across a broader geography. Or, in some cases, it's a building, a base of operations that can improve the quality of the production values that they're doing. For digital media, often, there's not a lot of equipment involved. Most of it is people. And so most of our financing in that case is working capital, but for specific initiatives, for example, moving into covering new kinds of content, or new areas, or maybe moving into an additional language, things that are going to grow their audience and their reach.
I feel like I'd love for you to give our audience a sense of what kind of impact you can have when you either stand up or embolden a media company in a place like the former Yugoslavia or some of these places in Africa where you work now. I don't want to steal your thunder, so what's your go-to story when you talk about the kind of power that this kind of work has?
Yeah, so we've worked with over 100 companies now in over 30 different countries, so I could tell you stories all day because most of these folks are pretty amazing. To give you just a couple, one that I would flag is a company called Malaysia Kini in Malaysia. So they started off back around 2000 at a time when all media in Malaysia was one way or the other controlled by the government, and and heavily censored, very limited licensing, only to government friends, let's say. And what was interesting back then was the guy who ran the country, Prime Minister Mahathir. He wanted to attract investment from dot-coms. It was the dawn of the dot-com age, and he wanted Malaysia to be the dot-com hub for Southeast Asia. And so he was, let's say, the online community convinced him that to do that he had to promise not to censor anybody on the internet. And that created an opportunity for Malaysia Kini to come into existence, an open shop in the middle of Kuala Lumpur and start providing independent journalism, in a very open way, with people signing their articles and, not being underground or anything like that. So that company has now grown to be the, number one news site in Malaysia.
Wow. Holy cow.
Yeah, and the two founders, Pramesh Chandran and Stephen Gann, fantastic guys. They do great journalism. They understand technology in a very deep way as well. And to give you a sense of their impact, before Malaysia Kini, nobody could really get an accurate picture of what was happening with elections in Malaysia. The most recent election, about 25% of the country was on Malaysia Kini's website on election night to understand what was really happening.
That's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people. They were getting, 500,000 hits a minute on their site. It was tremendous, and luckily they had really strengthened their operations so they could handle that much traffic. Mm-hmm. But it gives you a sense of the demand that there is for reliable information in what short supply it is.
And in that particular case, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole quite yet in our conversation, but they've built a reputation over time that people do consider them credible and reliable and a go-to source for what is the truth. Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And their their revenue model in a way is related to that. So they, long before the New York Times put up their paywall, Malaysia Kini put up a paywall as a way to get their readers to actually participate in the company's future. And that was a time when, you may remember everybody said nobody will pay for.
I was just going to say, this is early on. So they were, let's not say innovators, but they were just bold in saying, you know what, this is good enough that people are going to be willing to pay for it.
Yes. And we actually strongly encouraged them to do that because that was after the first dot-com crash. It was clear that it was going to be a long time before online advertising in Malaysia got to the point that it could support them, and they needed to go to a subscription model. What's interesting is, in a way, it's much more like the National Public Radio model here in the U.S., because the truth is, so for example, for many years, the security service in Malaysia was, every day scraping all the content from Malaysia Kini and then posting it on another site called Free Malaysia Kini as a way to undermine their ability to survive on their income. So really nobody had to subscribe to Malaysia Kini to get access to their content, but they continued to do so.
That's fantastic. So I'd love to go down the pathway of understanding the evolution of where you started in the 90s and, now we're in 2017, looking at 2018 at this stage. How has the way media is evolving changed your interaction with these companies or changed how you think their powers or what your hand in that process can be?
Mm-hmm. So the media industry has, obviously gone through extraordinary change in recent times because of what's commonly called digital disruption. And, when we started, the best journalism was generally being done by newspapers. And many of our clients, for, let's say, the first half of our history, were newspapers. The majority of them were. And we financed many of the first independent printing houses around the world. And it was a great investment, right? Because you would have a nice piece of equipment that you could, take as security. It freed the newspaper from the chokehold of state-owned printing houses. It freed a lot of other newspapers also from that chokehold, and it created a whole new revenue source for these companies from printing for other people, and it reduced their operating costs. So it was a great way to support independent media. The printing business had an innovation maybe every 5 years if you were lucky, and it was pretty small. So it was a business that you could really understand and predict. And in a way, most of the risk of doing something like that was the political risk of the environment. It wasn't the actual business that you were financing. Flash forward to the last 10 years, and there's an innovation in media, in digital media, like every 5 minutes, it feels like. It's a constantly evolving business.
Believe you me, as somebody who puts on a podcast, that is the truth.
I know you know what I'm saying. You're living it every day just like we are. And the nature of the business is completely different. So just take advertising sales. What I like to say, it used to be about martinis, and now it's about algorithms. It's not the same person who can sell advertising now, right? It's a totally
unpack that for me, because I doubt that many of our listeners will totally get that. It used to be about taking your clients out and pulling down the big clients and saying, okay, hey, you're going to buy an advertising package for X number of spots and whatnot. But now it's like, it's Facebook, advertising, or it's Google AdWords and these kinds of things. Maybe you explain it.
Well, I think you just explained it really well. And one way, it's like, it used to be Mad Men, the TV show about, the old advertising world, and now it's Silicon Valley. Right. It's really a different. So most of the ads today online, they're not sold person to person. They're sold almost instantaneously through online auction networks, and they call it real-time bidding. And so the art of advertising sales now is not, in many cases, and I should give that caveat that there are still certain kinds of advertising that are sold directly from person to person. Right, by convincing somebody that you can deliver a really powerful campaign for them. But most of online advertising is done programmatic. It's called programmatic advertising, and you manage it at your desktop by shifting algorithms all the time to try to understand how the market is moving online, and how do you respond to it, and how do you make changes to your website, to your social media feeds, to all of these things to maximize the amount of ads you can sell and the price you can get for it. So it's a very different kind of skill set, and it's in particular in the countries where we work, and we work in emerging markets, frontier markets. So our geographic range goes from Ukraine down to Zimbabwe, from Guatemala to Malaysia, all over Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Eastern Europe. We're there. And these skill sets are in very high demand in those countries. So it really changes the game for media companies as they move into digital media.
So are you able to see into the future? Like, one of the questions I like to say is, you're keeping up. I mean, obviously you've evolved and you're able to not only provide access to financing, but let's say technical support, for lack of a better term, to these organizations. But, are you able to see 2 or 3 years out right now and kind of help guide these organizations about not only the human resources they need, but maybe new equipment, new outlet, new advertising options, new business models, those kinds of things?
Well, we like to think so. You'll have to ask me again in 2 to 3 years to see how well we're doing. But there are a few pieces to it. So, one, we're placing bets. We are an investment fund, so we're putting down money, right, based on our view of what the future is. And for digital media, there are a few different ways that we see the field moving that can be the basis for successful businesses that achieve the mission outcomes that we're looking for. And it varies country to country. So we see advertising-based models still being viable in larger countries like India, for example. Those are places where cost structure is it's relatively low. The demand is huge, and India is one of the few countries where newspapers continue to be strong. They have newspapers with 8 million subscribers. It's a huge number. The New York Times at its height was about 1.5 million, and it's still extremely strong business-wise. But that moment is receding. Eventually, it will go away, and there will be. We believe there are a few key players that can be the future of independent journalism in India. One of them is called Scroll. It's a great digital media company that started a couple of years ago. And they've been kind of sweeping all the journalism awards in India. They have a very lean model, because there's an old way of producing content that involves a lot of people. There's a new way of producing content that can be done by many fewer people. And often, that, as I said, the skill set, even on the journalism side, is very different from what it used to be. So if you can start off with folks who are native to that kind of form of news production that really understand social media and the role of social media in reaching an audience, you have a chance to disrupt the existing media ecosystem. And we believe India is a place where it really needs to be disrupted. The mainstream media there is not at all reliable.
Do you find so let's just say that India wants to be disrupted across your network. Do you find, for instance, will people look to Malaysia Kini for some of their models? And do you facilitate those conversations about saying, hey, what really worked in Zimbabwe or what really worked in Ukraine was this, and maybe you should do that? Or do you not, you kind of leave it to them?
No, absolutely. I think one of the strengths is we've been able to build up a network of companies that face very similar challenges all around the world. So to give you, a great example, so for the past year, the CEO of Malaysia Kini has been our entrepreneur in residence.
Cool.
And he's been going around, helping other media companies, do what Malaysia Kini's been able to do. And that's, he's been working with companies in Zimbabwe, in Myanmar. This is the way that we, leverage our best, most successful companies.
Are you able to tell us what an average size investment might be, either in the loan or the equity, whatever products that you put on the street? Are we talking in the tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars, or what does it look like?
It's a pretty big range. So, I can tell you the smallest loan we ever made was $5,000.
Awesome.
The biggest investment we ever made was, $9 million. So it's a pretty big range. Generally, we don't like to go under $100,000. Our average financing at the moment is about $850,000. And in a way, that number is reducing because investment for digital media is often much smaller than it was for example, to build a printing house.
I'm really fascinated that you guys started in the 90s and now you're looking at 20s. Just the evolution of the media business, obviously it's on the tip of my tongue or something I look at every day. What are the challenges that you bump up against every day and maybe that you're looking at for the future? Is it just sort of getting access and getting in there and being awareness about this? Is it getting some of the people that you've invested in or some of the companies you've invested in, they get shut down? Is it still kind of the old school, hey, we don't have a free press kind of stuff? Or what are the biggest hurdles?
Well, I think that the biggest challenge today is the rollback of press freedom around the world. So there are a bunch of indices that kind of measure press freedom. Freedom House puts out one, another organization called Reporters Without Borders. And, according to all of those indices, there's been a significant rollback of press freedom in many, many countries. And we can experience it here, even in the U.S. The current administration's approach to media is radically different from anything we've seen before. And that has really strong knock-on effects in the rest of the world. So a number of months ago, for example, Cambodia, the government in Cambodia increased their criticism and their control of media there, and they pointed to what Trump said about media being the enemy of the people and accused them, basically attached the fake news label to what is legitimate news. Many of the things that we're seeing here in the U.S., we've been dealing with those issues since the beginning. That's been our mission. And I don't think the U.S. will ever experience it the way other countries have experienced it. But the effects here, what's happening here, does have a very strong effect because, in a way, the U.S. journalism has kind of been the beacon for journalism around the world in many ways. And the U.S. principles of freedom of the press has also been a beacon that can be referenced. And, as that light becomes dimmer, it becomes dimmer in the rest of the world. Here we've been talking about alternative facts. It's like a new idea that was introduced.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
It's nothing, in the rest of the world, it's just called propaganda. And it is being legitimized by what's happening here.
It's not our place necessarily to be political in this, but
sorry.
No, it's fine. I'm fascinated by this conversation simply because I spend most of my time in Bangkok, and it's a place where if you put a Facebook page up that is negative towards the royal family, you can find yourself in jail for 20 years, and that's it's literally that simple. We know cases of that, but I'm just wondering about the fact that when you started this in the 90s, it was still, as you said, you're building buildings, you're putting up a printing press, those kinds of things. Now it's, a couple $1,000s can get you a very attractive looking website and put together, enough working capital to fund some what looks like legitimate stuff out there. And are you finding that the companies you've invested in, they're sort of at war now? Like this is, they're combating this, and are they being successful, or is this something where they're saying, we still have the upper hand and, we shall prevail kind of stuff?
So just to make sure I'm answering you properly, you're kind of talking about the fake news phenomenon.
Sure, yeah. It's
where it's just very easy for somebody to put up a website and spread, make up stuff and make it look like legitimate news.
Not only fake news and, from just sort of having a website stand up, but, they can buy ads, they can place advertisements on Facebook, they can place advertisements on Google, that look legitimate, looks like real stuff. But it's for the average consumer of information, it's really difficult to tell what's legitimate and what's not legitimate.
Yeah. And again, I think that's something that varies country to country. So I think countries that have people who have lived in these environments for a long time actually are much better equipped than people in the U.S. are to draw those distinctions.
That's a really interesting thing. That's okay. Touche. Touche. Yeah. Okay. And, maybe this is the American in me saying, this is such a huge thing, but I do want to draw a caveat there. So, in a way, you could look at Russia, and there was a long history of reading between the lines to understand what was really going on, right? In Soviet times, everything that was being produced was propaganda. So, but there was something there. People had an understanding of how to kind of read between the lines and pick out what was true from everything else around it. Whether that, to what extent has that survived to today? And as you say, I think the tools that folks who want to put false information across are much more powerful. So in Russia in particular, I think the government there has been very effective in using TV especially, and to a lesser degree, online media to really disinform the population there. That being said, like I said, there are a lot of people who can see through that. But it's, we're looking to work with companies that have established a kind of trust relationship with their audience. They're never going to be able to have that trust relationship with everybody, but even for folks who may not agree with their point of view, let's say, I think the fundamental accuracy of what they're saying is understood. Another example, election example from Montenegro. So we work with a company there called TVVSD. VSD means truth. In that country, if you look at elections, it's pretty evenly split between the two sides, let's say, in that country. And despite that, on election night, 80% of the TV audience was on TVVSD, right? Watching TVVSD because They knew they were the ones who were going to, regardless of what the outcome was, they were going to present the accurate view of it, as opposed to the public television there, which is not public television in the sense like the BBC or NPR. It's state-controlled media. One final question down this rabbit hole that we're in right now is...
We're going pretty deep.
It was this.
And I'm not telling you stories.
No. I actually really appreciate it. I wish we had 3 hours to talk about it, right? But to what extent is every company a media company now? Have you played a part, or are you having a role in this conversation now where every company has a website, every company is advertising, everybody out there, essentially information, we trade on information everywhere. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think it's true in a sense. And in a way, I think there's a much bigger phenomenon going on there, right? It's the way that internet has given people direct access to original sources. Right. So whether that's a company that wants to talk about what they're doing, or whether it's Human Rights Watch who wants people to see their report. Before, nobody had an easy way to get a Human Rights Watch report. They read about it in a newspaper. Right. Now, it's very easy. They can maybe hear about it in a newspaper, but they can go and read the original source if they want to. And I think that's, in both of those cases, business wanting to talk to an audience and other people who are producing information, and how people connect to it has changed radically. And for us, it actually, we started diving into that question very deeply around 2011, 2012. We went through a whole process of rethinking our mission. How does that kind of change affect our mission? And I think that's interesting. Previously, I think we always defined ourselves as, our mission was the support of independent journalism. But we took a look at what our real goals were, and it was that list of things that I said at the beginning of this interview, right? Accountability, transparency, democratic participation. And we felt, as an organization, we had to recognize that there's a much broader category of businesses that can advance that mission than just journalism organizations because of the power of technology. So we've been investing in companies, still many of our companies are journalism-based and news organizations, but we're investing in a wider range of companies that are looking to leverage that direct contact between people and information. So for example, in Brazil, we've been working with a company called Colab. And what their business is essentially it's a social network that's built around an app. And it lets people communicate directly with local governments about very kind of micro issues that they face. Everything from trash collection to identifying locations, Zika outbreaks and dengue outbreaks. And also they've been able to use that platform for the participatory budget process, which is a new phenomenon in Brazil. But it really enables participatory government in a new kind of way. And there's no journalism involved there, right? It's citizen-created information. And for us, what's important is the platform also allows folks to then track how the government is responding to those issues. So it's a great mechanism for promoting accountability and transparency. Another model like that we've been working with in India. It's a great company called Gramvani, and they're using cell phones to create social networks for people who are poor and illiterate, which is a large part of the population of India still. And, they're, in a way, they've been left behind by the digital age, right? Because if you're illiterate, it's very hard to take advantage of the internet. So this is a system that lets people call in, choose whether they want to, hear music or hear news or report a story of corruption or report, a disease outbreak and, roll up that information and, get it out there, both by communicating to the people on the ground, who are using the system, but then also making governments and other news organizations aware of those issues. Again, they're not creating content themselves. It's all citizen-created content.
Harlan, as with most guests, I feel like we could probably have a conversation for several more hours here. But I have two more questions for you that I ask everyone on the show.
I'll try to be more succinct.
Not at all. Who do you pay attention to other than obviously this network of media companies and obviously other new companies that you're investing in, as you were just describing? Who do you pay attention to stay up to date about new trends, about new stuff, about new innovations, especially in the media world? Is there a Twitter feed? Is there a blog post? Is there an author or some other feed that you would recommend to our audience?
There are so many, I have to say. If I were to pick out, one or two, one, Quartz, I think, is a great thing to be reading. I think they capture kind of general innovation around the world in a very nice way, and they themselves are, I think, very innovative in how they're approaching content and media. The other things I think are much more geared to professionals. It's the nature of feeds that I don't really know what they're called. They just show up.
Sure, exactly. That's why we all have media readers, right?
In terms of trends, I think one thing that I'm really taken by, in recent years is the development of investigative reporting networks. The kind of the most, I'd say, famous result of that is Panama Papers, which is produced by the International Consortium of Independent Journalists. And again, they're able to use new technologies to approach investigations in a completely different way. Cross-border investigations are incredibly powerful, and so much of what is wrong in the world is multinational these days. And with the Panama Papers, you had stories affecting 79 different countries being produced by a far-flung network of investigative journalists. Similarly, in Brazil, the Odebrecht scandal, so it's a giant Brazilian construction company that's been the centerpiece of one of the biggest corruption scandals ever in Brazil. But they operated in many, many countries, and there's now a network of investigative journalists around Latin America who've taken what started in Brazil and made it a continent-wide story, because they were just bribing people all over the world. So, and I think that's something that's going to grow more and more.
So maybe my last question you may have already just answered, but the last question specifically, is there something outside the media world or outside what your organization does that is an innovation, a shiny new object, a process, a technology, a thing that it doesn't get enough attention, or it's just emerging now and you think it deserves a shout out that you'd like to let our audience know about?
It's something that I call the power of resilience. And to give you a good example of what I mean by that, so we work with a radio network in Nepal called Ujjalo, and they own and operate a radio station in Kathmandu and in the two next largest cities in Nepal, but their programming is carried by 175 stations around the country. So they grew up in a kind of haphazard way. So they had their operations spread over 4 or 5 locations around Kathmandu. So we provided financing for them to construct one single headquarters where they could bring it all together with a much more powerful transmitter on top. And the founder of that company, who really is a visionary guy, he had 2 conditions for that building. 1, that it be earthquake proof, and 2, that it be solar powered. So because of that, when the earthquake hit Nepal a couple of years ago, they were the only nationwide broadcaster besides the state broadcasting network that was left standing, because their building was still there with their transmitter on top, and they were solar powered, so they could stay in operation. And because of that, they were able to provide really critical information about how to access shelter and food, medical services, and construction resources around the country. And we talk a lot about resilience, I think, now in the environmental sense, but I think it has, thinking about the importance of resilience in many different parts of industry, certainly in the media field. It's a critical infrastructure as far as we're concerned. And making sure that it's resilient is as important as far as we're concerned, as important as making sure your dams or your transportation systems are resilient.
Harlan, this has been a fascinating conversation. I hope that we'll have the ability to continue it sometime in the future. But thank you for being a guest on the show today.
Really a pleasure. Great talking to you.
Hey guys, if you get value out of these conversations like this one with Harlan, could you just do me a second, take another 10 seconds out of your day and click a review on iTunes? 5 stars would be great if you can, or just leave an honest feedback on iTunes, or share this on Twitter or Facebook with your community. And of course, if you have a question, if you have a comment, or you want to just interact, hit me up on either Twitter, Facebook, or on our blog.